Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for another episode of our mini psychology school, brought to you by the Collaborative Network for Training and Excellence in Psychotraumatology. My name is Christina Gleeson, and I'm a doctoral researcher and Marie Curie Research Fellow with Context, and I'm based in the School of Psychology at Ulster University, Coleraine in Northern Ireland. My research focuses on the area of refugee and asylum seeker trauma and how factors in the host or resettlement environment relate to mental health outcomes within these populations. So today's presentation is about asylum seeker post-migration stressors and mental health. It will focus on 8 of the more common stressors experienced by asylum seekers in their host countries, and it will look at how these factors are associated with stress-related and common mental health disorders within this population. We begin today's presentation by defining the term asylum seeker and looking at what this term means within international law. So, an asylum seeker, as it's defined in international law, as an individual, so who, owing to a fear for their safety or a threat to their life, is forced to flee their country of origin. So asylum seekers typically are defined as forced migrants. So they experience what is known as forced migration. And it's important to note that this is very different to, say, for example, economic migration. So the difference being that an economic migrant is an individual who chooses to leave their country of origin, and they do so with the intention of improving their financial situation. So this is very different to, for example, leaving one's country of origin because of the kind of the background or the environment and how that is a threat to their life, and feeling a feeling of force, feeling an onus on them to leave because they fear for their safety, and indeed their life, and their life depends on them leaving their country of origin. So international law states that everyone is entitled to seek asylum under the 1951 Refugee Convention. So although everyone has the legal right to seek asylum, asylum isn't guaranteed. So applications must meet the standards set by each country. And across most European states, for instance, there's a single procedure for applying for the right to stay in an EU country, and the onus is on the applicant, so the individual seeking asylum, to prove that there is a well-founded fear. We're going to start by speaking a little bit about the concept of trauma as it's applied to asylum seekers worldwide. So research shows that asylum seekers are one of the most trauma-exposed populations in the world, and they typically experience 2 to 3 times more trauma than the general population. So asylum seekers are very vulnerable to traumatic experiences or stress-related experiences in a threefold way. This is known as a triple trauma, or the triple trauma paradigm. So asylum seekers tend to experience what is known as co-occurrence. That is, they almost always experience more than one trauma, and traumas are often related to each other in a very intricate way. Asylum seekers are exposed to trauma in 3 specific ways related to their experience of forced migration and having to leave their country of origin for fear of their safety. So these are pre-migration, so referring to before exile, perimigration, so during exile itself, so the journey, and post-migration, and this refers to the time within the resettlement country or the host country, so where an asylum seeker eventually arrives to apply for international protection. And as you can see from our slides, we begin by looking at the first phase of the forced migration journey, which is pre-migration, and within this situation, within this context, asylum seekers experience a tremendous amount of trauma. So pre-migration trauma is the reason why an individual would flee their country of origin in the first instance. And these types of trauma can be assaultive or non-assaultive, so they may or may not involve the infliction of physical harm. So these include experiences such as war, torture, persecution, be it religious or political, physical and sexual assault, and these are just a few examples of the types of trauma experienced by asylum seekers. And the research on this population and on the trauma that they are exposed to shows that when looked at according to gender, that males tend to experience more trauma than females worldwide. And studies published in the field of forced migration and associated traumatic experiences will often talk about the link between pre-migration trauma and psychological morbidity. So there's a very strong connection there between the trauma that asylum seekers are exposed to in their country of origin and psychological outcomes. And pre-migration trauma is linked very strongly with stress-related mental health disorders, including post-traumatic stress disorder and complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And it's also linked with common mental health disorders such as depression and anxiety. And even though males, as we've touched upon previously, are reported to experience more trauma, women have a higher rate of mental health disorders within this particular group. And next we move on to the perimigration phase, which refers to the migration journey itself. So travel can be done legally or illegally, depending on the reason for leaving the country of origin. A person may have more or less time to plan their journey. So some people will have time to gather the necessary documents and others won't. So it may be safe for some individuals to travel using their legal names and known transport methods, and for others personal details and legal names and original documentation may not be feasible. It may not be safe or possible for individuals to use these traveling. So considering the different journeys that people have, it's important not to assume a mindset that asylum seekers follow one particular journey. Those seeking asylum have many diverse means of traveling. They often travel by, say, plane or boat, train or car, or other means. So traveling from one country to another can bring many difficulties as well. And it can expose these populations to further traumatic events. These include death of family members, forced separation from family members and friends, rape or sexual assault, prostitution, financial extortion, human trafficking. And of course, a large proportion of asylum seekers will experience perimigration trauma. So this is reported as large as 89%. And the threats to life and physical and psychological safety are varied among this population. In the post-migration phase that follows, the traumatic stressors tend to be related to social assimilation and involved with everyday living factors. So the post-migration period refers to the phase of migration after entering the host environment or the host country. So these living difficulties are varied and multifarious, and they can depend on the type of pre-migration trauma and peri-migration trauma that an individual has experienced in the past. So, the process of trying to navigate life in a new country, coupled with the traumatic events preceding this, they can be very, very challenging. So it's important to remember how entering a safe country is not necessarily equated with an instant improvement in one's mental health or one's mental health status. In today's presentation, this particular phase and these stressors that affect mental health are of particular interest. And we look at 7 of the most frequently cited stressors that are encountered in the host country. And to follow this, we'll look at the relationship with stress-related and common mental health disorders in this population. So the 7 post-migration factors that we're going to explore today are length of asylum process and duration of stay. So the length of time someone has to wait for their application to be processed and to hear a final decision, and then following from this, residency status as well, and things like family, social integration, and social networks, so whether this is weak or strong, finance, employment, housing, and accommodation. So we know that the longer someone has to wait for their application to be processed and a decision to be made, it increases the negative mental health impacts. And it's been acknowledged as one of the strongest predictors of overall low quality of life, increased physical disability, and somatic complaints, so bodily issues in an asylum seeking population. So on the right of this slide, you can see the agreed timescale for processing applications for asylum in 6 EU member states, and these range from 10 business days in Switzerland to 6 months in countries such as the Netherlands. This was originally theorized as one of the benefits of introducing a single procedure in EU states, that the time it would take to process applications would be considerably shorter, and this may have been a benefit, but considering that these timescales are regularly exceeded by EU member states, often by years, the agreed timescale doesn't necessarily reflect the reality of the time it takes to process these applications. And very closely related to this actually is our second factor. So this refers to legal status or residency status. So this is another very important post-migration factor. Residency status is what distinguishes asylum seekers from refugees. So asylum seekers are not guaranteed the right to stay in the host country, whereas refugees have been given permanent residence. So that's one of the clear distinctions between these two populations, and we know from the research that getting permanent residence improves overall health of the population. But this is more to do with the benefits that come along with status, as opposed to just the fact of being granted status itself. And these include things such as wider access to education. So educational access or achievement is often stunted by the fact that asylum seekers have limited access to this, whereas those who are citizens would have a greater access to educational opportunities such as third level education. Employment as well as another factor, and financial improvements, and these all come with being granted status. Like for instance, the approval of status would lead to the approval of being able to work as well, and work more jobs that would be available to citizens or to permanent residents than might be available to asylum seekers. And the research shows that those with uncertain status have a greater risk for post-traumatic stress disorder and depression and anxiety when compared with refugees. The status has a very big influence on someone's mental health outcomes. Family and family support is another factor which greatly influences someone's ability to integrate in their host country. So family is one of the 3 main mechanisms through which legal status or the benefits of legal status operates to improve things like symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder and anxiety and depression, stress related to missing family members, worrying about family safety or not being able to go back home, and loneliness increase the chance of individuals having one or more psychiatric disorders. As you can see from our slide as well, family related issues can be very distressing to individuals in the host country and affect overall subjective well-being. Equally so, trying to fit within a new country and develop social contacts and social networks can be a very daunting task, and not least because of the struggles of trying to integrate with nationals and other non-nationals. So, but also the task of integrating into one's own ethnic group within in the host environments. The difficulties with the latter, particularly, has been associated with the current PTSD diagnosis for individuals when they reach the host country. We can see here from the slides as well that post-traumatic growth has a strong negative association with poor social integration and weak social networks. So post-traumatic growth is very much linked with someone's ability to integrate into the host environment. So we know that weak social integration into society increases the chance of psychiatric morbidity. And social integration problems are significantly associated with health-related quality of life and overall functional impairment in this population. Financial worries as well are also another big stressor in the host environment in the post-migration phase, and asylum seekers are typically dependent on state subsistence to live day to day, and the financial subsistence is quite low across EU states, and there are usually very strict conditions attached to state financial support. So in order to receive daily living allowances, for example, asylum seekers must live in state provided direct provision, so they cannot choose to live with family or friends, or they will lose this benefit. And as you can see from the graph on this slide, these payments are very low. So if individuals do choose to leave state provided accommodation and live with family or friends, which it would be natural that they might choose to do so, they won't receive any state financial assistance, and they will be forced to find their own means of financial support, of financing day-to-day living. So that can be quite difficult as well, and it creates a situation in which asylum seekers may feel forced to live within the state provided accommodation, because if they choose not to do so, they would be dependent largely on their family or friends for financial support. Asylum seekers are also very limited in many countries as to the type of work they can do, or if indeed they are allowed to work at all. And many of those who seek asylum each year are trained professionals who are medical doctors, nurses, solicitors, etc. And they're very well-trained professionals, but they are unable to work and being refused employment either due to discrimination or laws prohibiting asylum seekers from working for pay, or indeed having to work only certain jobs. It has very detrimental consequences, and unemployment is reported to have one of the most significant correlations with psychiatric illness, and not only psychiatric illness but the severity of the symptoms of those illnesses as well. And this is particularly notable with regard to depressive symptomology. Most asylum seekers are resident in state provided accommodation, and these residents are typically communal with more than one person to a room. So it's very rare that any individual would have a private room, and indeed individuals don't get to choose who they share those rooms with, and oftentimes that can cause issues or conflicts or stress for individuals where sharing their space is not conducive to improvements in their mental well-being. So accommodation provision is very similar across all EU states, and these are usually composed of initial reception centres or collective accommodation or decentralized accommodation. So the initial point of stay for asylum seekers would be the reception centres, where they would typically be expected to stay for very limited amounts of time, and then they will be moved to collective accommodations. And because of the large number of asylum seekers that have come to stay in the EU, a collective accommodation, the capacity is not enough to meet the needs. So there has been a growing trend in decentralized accommodation, where Governments will pay for hotels or bed and breakfasts, and offer accommodation for asylum seekers within those places. So originally the numbers were not as large as they are currently. So decentralized accommodation is very regularly offered to those who cannot be housed within collective accommodation that was originally built to host asylum seekers within each of the states. Because of many of the difficulties that asylum seekers experience and their high rate of traumatic exposure, they tend to have higher levels of stress-related disorders, such as post-traumatic stress disorder, which you've mentioned earlier, and complex post-traumatic stress disorder, as well as common disorders like depression and anxiety. And they're more regularly experienced by asylum seekers than they are within the general population. So now we're going to look briefly at these disorders and how they relate to asylum seekers specifically. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a stress and trauma-related mental health disorder or illness, and it's commonly experienced by asylum seekers. The literature and research indicate. And symptoms, as you can see from our slide there, can have an acute onset, or they can manifest years after the event. And it was first thought PTSD was a disorder peculiar to combat veterans, and it was first known as shell shock, and was a disorder experienced by US military during the Vietnam War. And later on, it was recognized that this disorder could be experienced by anyone who had been exposed to a traumatic event, and it didn't have to be related to war. And studies have shown that the female asylum seekers in particular tend to exhibit more symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder than male. Complex PTSD is another outcome of the asylum seeking experience, and it's theorized as a sibling disorder of PTSD. So it's very closely related to post-traumatic stress disorder. But in order to be diagnosed with complex PTSD, you must show symptoms consistent with PTSD, but also with symptoms related to DSO, so disturbance in self-organization. DSO symptoms are proposed to encompass these differences and are characterized typically by 3 symptom clusters, and these symptom clusters relate to affective dysregulation, negative self-concept, and disturbances in relationships. And torture, which is a significant and recurring trauma experienced by asylum seekers, and there's a high endorsement rate in the literature for torture experiences, personal experiences, but also witnessing torture by asylum seekers. And it's proposed to increase the likelihood of a complex PTSD. However, though, whereas PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is more common in asylum seekers, complex PTSD is less so. Depression and anxiety are 2 of the most common mental health disorders experienced by not only asylum seekers but also the general population. And depression and anxiety are actually more prevalent among asylum seekers than post-traumatic stress disorder, and these disorders are usually found to co-occur both in the general population and in the asylum seeking population. For asylum seekers, these can also be seen to co-occur with post-traumatic stress disorder, and the research indicates that asylum seekers experience moderate to severe levels of depression, and this is highly associated with pre and post-migration factors. So pre-migration factors, pre-migration trauma, so the kind of trauma that has been experienced, and also the kind of the social environmental factors and stressors in the host environment. And depressive symptomology has been shown to differ before and after the asylum interview. So we know that the length of time waiting for the interview, and also the stress that leads up to that and afterwards have very different effects on depressive symptomology. So we know that residency status is associated with depression as it is associated with anxiety. So we know that knowing the certainty of your status affects that particular mental health outcome. So to conclude, just some brief final thoughts to wrap up the presentation. So we have to be mindful that asylum seekers don't fit any one profile, and we cannot assume a universal depiction or description of the asylum seeking experience. Experiences are unique and complex, and importantly, reaching safe land is not the end of the journey. For this population, it is only when settling into the host environment that the mental health issues can be dealt with sufficiently. So one of the take homes that we should have from this presentation is that asylum seekers' experiences are varied and they're cumulative and co-occurring, and trauma has three dimensions to it for this particular population, and so it's very complex, and there are very difficult and many issues that they come to the host environment with, and the stressors within the new country or the safe country can often exacerbate any pre-existing mental health issues, and can indeed lead to new mental health issues that may not have been prevalent before. So I'd like to thank you all for joining us for this episode of our mini psychology school series, brought to you by the Collaborative Network for Training and Excellence in Psychotraumatology. In Context has received funding from European Union's Horizon 2020 Research and Innovation Programme under the Marie Curie Grant, and it's with the funding and help of the European Union that we were able to make this series for you, and we hope you've enjoyed it.